I'd like to begin by emphasizing that Russia considers itself at war with the United States and European nations, specifically the UK, since the US and UK have launched their missiles into the territory of Russia.
It is not Russia, but the United States who have destroyed the system of international security. And they are trying to preserve their hegemony and stoking a global conflict. We have always preferred, and we still prefer, to resolve our disagreements and using peaceful means, but we are prepared for any scenario. And if anyone has any doubts, they shouldn't. There will always be a response.
We are right now on the escalation ladder, inching towards a nuclear war. The Russians and the United States are de facto right now in a war.
Well, I have at least two sources right now telling me that Russian nuclear rocket forces are on full alert. They are at the highest level of readiness they have ever achieved.
Putin just put us on notice that he has a conventional missile system that is designed to preempt anything and everything NATO plans on doing to Russia, and there is no NATO response. This is literally the equivalent of the most alpha wolf in the world coming in and pissing all over your home. That's what Putin just did, and it didn't have to be this way. I don't think the West has woken up to what has just happened. It is over for the West. Putin has literally given the West two options: capitulate or nuclear war. We have to find a way to find a third option.
So if you live in a city, that would be what you would be looking at. The scientific studies predict that 150 to 180 million tons of smoke and soot would rise into the stratosphere. And in a matter of 10 days to 2 weeks, the high winds in the stratosphere would spread it around the world and cause a global stratospheric smoke layer to form. And this smoke would block about 70% of the sunlight in the northern hemisphere and 35% in the southern.
And I'm telling you authoritatively and truly, they lie about every goddamn thing about these wars. And how many times did the New York Times report on Operation Timber Sycamore, which was the presidential order to the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad? 3 times in 10 years. This is not democracy. This is a game. And it's a game of narrative. Why did the U.S. invade Iraq in 2003? It was a phony war. Where did that war come from? You know what? It's quite surprising. That war came from Netanyahu, actually. You know that? It's weird. They did focus groups on the war. They wanted the war all the time. They had to figure out how to sell the war to the American people. They don't care at all about democracy, by the way. At all. They topple governments they don't like that won't do their bidding. Everybody understand, what does it mean to stand with Ukraine? It means 2,000 Ukrainians killed or wounded severely every single day. That's not standing with Ukraine. That is standing with the destruction of Ukraine. God forbid a nuclear power comes at us. I don't know what's going to happen. But we came at them. We have to understand the most basic points. Stay out of each other's lane so that we don't end up all dead. It's not so hard.
They can't afford a defeat, a Ukrainian defeat before the election. That's what they're worried about. And so they're trying to prevent that.
Something like this only because you have the French and the British also wanting to escalate in order to drag the United States in and lock in the United States to continue to have to provide assistance.
Attacks against the Bryansk region where these missiles were used. It's a signal saying that they want an escalation.
What I can tell you is that, again, we're going to continue to support Ukraine with what it needs to be successful on the battlefield.
So if we have nuclear weapon, if you prefer materialism and technologies then rather than spiritual matter, so you will pay for that by extinction of your mechanical civilizations. For Ukraine, it is our Kurukshetra, and Putin is Arjuna. He's heroic actor in our history and maybe in the world's history, but he will fight until the end.
When the prophet said that you'll make an alliance with Rome, of course, this is Akhiru Zaman. That you're going to make an alliance with Rome in Akhiru Zaman. And so we're now seeing the fulfillment of that prophecy. Which Christian people is Allah talking about? You can't study international relations and study the history of international politics without coming to face with this arrogance. The colonization of the rest of the world, so that they can civilize the rest of the world. This is not Orthodox Christianity, not at all. I hope the Darul Uloom is listening. The more they close the doors of the Darul Uloom and the masjid to me, the more knowledge Allah gives to me. So keep on closing the doors. Keep on closing the doors.
I'd like to begin by emphasizing that Russia considers itself at war with the United States and European nations, specifically the UK, since the US and UK have launched their missiles into the territory of Russia.
The Russian citizens and our friends around the world, as well as those who still nurture illusions that a strategic defeat can be inflicted against Russia. As a result of the escalation, the United States and their NATO allies said that they give their permission to use long-range weapons against targets inside Russia. Starting from that point, as we have underscored many times, the regional conflict in Ukraine, provoked by the West, acquired a global character. Our anti-missile systems countered those attacks. As a result, the targets and objectives set by the enemy were not achieved. As a response to the use of US and UK manufactured weapons, the Russian forces have carried out a combined strike on one of the military-industrial facilities in Ukraine. And this included the test of a novel intermediate-range Russian missile system. A ballistic missile with a non-nuclear hypersonic payload was used. The test was carried out successfully. The objectives of the launch have been met. One of the largest and well-known industrial centers that is known since the Soviet times in the Dnieper region, which is known and to be involved in enemy production, was hit. And further plans are being made in Europe and the Asia Pacific to deploy weapons and missiles. The use of the novel system, and which was essentially an operational test, was carried out in response to the decisions made by the United States and their allies. The further course of action will be determined based on the threats to the security of the Russian Federation. We believe that we have the right to use our weapons against military facilities of countries who allow their weapons to be used against ours. And in case of an escalation, we will act as decisively in a mirror fashion. The ruling elites of the countries are nurturing plans to use their military contingents against Russia should be warned. When choosing measures to be used in response, such as the use of systems that was tested recently in Ukraine, will certainly include warnings to civilians and to clear the zones that will be targeted. And we will certainly do this in a transparent fashion. And we do not have any fears that it will reduce the effectiveness of those systems, because there is no way to counteract a missile that flies at 10 Mach, which is 2.5 to 3 kilometers per second. Existing anti-missile systems and the anti-missile systems deployed by the United States and Europe cannot intercept such missiles. It is impossible. So, once again, it is not Russia, but the United States who have destroyed the system of international security. And they are trying to preserve their hegemony and stoking a global conflict. We have always preferred, and we still prefer, to resolve our disagreements and using peaceful means, but we are prepared for any scenario. And if anyone has any doubts, they shouldn't. There will always be a response.
So we wargamed this scenario, exactly this scenario back in the intelligence community. And we are right now on the escalation ladder, inching towards a nuclear war. The Russians and the United States are de facto right now in a war. Why is that? It is because those attackers don't fire by themselves, even though a Ukrainian soldier technically can push the button, but the targeting of the weapon systems, ensuring that there's a proper flight trajectory of the missile, that it destroys the right target, the actual battle damage achieved that we wanted to achieve, it all requires U.S. personnel and U.S. satellites. This is why the Russians have stated that the United States and European targets are now in crosshairs. And every war game that we conducted back in the intelligence community ended up in a nuclear war.
So what else has happened? Well, a couple of days ago, it was on Judge Napolitano's broadcast, Colonel Macgregor stated that Russia has placed its nuclear forces on full alert.
Well, I have at least two sources right now telling me that Russian nuclear rocket forces are on full alert. They are at the highest level of readiness they have ever achieved, which means that they are literally a short message away from launching nuclear warheads on missiles against anyone that threatens them, whether it's the United States or its surrogates in Eastern Europe. So that much has happened, which suggests to me that the Russians have taken this very seriously.
I would think that the United States would make a corresponding increase in its DEFCON status if they detect that Russia has done that. So it's very likely that both the United States and Russia have moved to very close to nuclear warfighting status with their DEFCON. Russia has begun production of mobile nuclear shelters and distributing these. These are protected citizens from various threats, particularly radiation. They can be equipped with air filters. Russia recently announced, well, the spokesperson for the foreign ministry announced that the Aegis Ashore missile base in Poland is now a priority target. The U.S. also has a similar base in Romania. The Polish base is 741 miles away from Moscow. That's about the distance of Quebec City from Washington, D.C. The Romanian base is 811 miles. That's like Thunder Bay over on the northern edge of Lake Superior for Washington. I suspect the United States wouldn't appreciate that if they had missile bases placed in those locations. These systems use a Mk-41 vertical launch system, and it can be used to launch nuclear-armed Tomahawk cruise missiles. This is a selection of missiles that can be used. You can see in the center, anti-air warfare, the SM-6 missile, which may eventually be replaced with a hypersonic weapon that can hit Moscow in 4 to 5 minutes. I suppose it could be fitted with a nuclear warhead. But you can see over here, the Tomahawk missile is one of the weapons that's loaded into the Mark 41. So you can understand why Russia would consider this to be a priority target, because the Tomahawk missile can hit Moscow in about an hour or so, and the hypersonic weapons that soon to follow will be in a matter of minutes. I think that if they're foolish enough to attack the cursed nuclear power plant, they could start a nuclear war. Russia would retaliate with a nuclear strike. The nuclear power plant is within range of all the missiles, the ATACMS and Storm Shadow Scout missiles. This is a image that the French nuclear IRSN organization created to show the spread of cesium-137 after the Chernobyl reactor blew up in 1986. These reactors have a graphite core which will burn. So the line at the bottom down there shows as a progression over a 3-week period as the radiation spread throughout Europe, and I mean, it went everywhere. We got some in North America too, but the areas around Chernobyl and Belarus were really hard hit. This is a map and I made in 1996 by the CIA. The darkest red areas are the exclusion zones. They're too radioactive for people to live in. There's still about 1,100 square mile there. Cesium-137 has a 30-year half-life, so to get 5 half-lives, you will get down to about 3%. 10 half-lives, 1%, but you're talking about 200 to 300 years before you can really live in an area like that. So that shows you what the implications of hitting these reactors. Well, of course, the U.S. and Russia can each launch 800 to 1,000 strategic nuclear warheads at each other in a matter of minutes. This is an image of a 100 megaton, well, this is a 50 megaton bomb that was detonated in 1961 by the Russians. I believe this photograph was taken at least 75 or 100 miles away from the detonation. It's detonated in a remote area where there weren't a lot of forests or anything, but had it been detonated in an area where it was heavily forested or urban, it would set enormous fires. Dr. Postal created an image of what it would happen if the Belgorod used 6 of these torpedoes, these drone submarines, to hit the East Coast. And the largest yellow circular area depicts a fire zone. Would be 17,000 square kilometers or 6,500 square miles for each one of these detonations would be set on fire. This is a video I created some time ago that shows what happens. I shortened it a little bit, but it shows what happens when Russians respond with an attack on NATO forces, and it goes from there. These are counterforce strikes where the U.S. responds and hitting targets in Russia to take out its nuclear forces, but it's not going to arrive in time to do that, and a full-scale nuclear war results. And there'll be more than 4,000 nuclear detonations that incinerate all the major cities in the U.S., Europe. China would probably be involved too, but the massive nuclear firestorms from these would literally cover hundreds of thousands of square miles. Everything that's flammable in the fire zone would burn. There would be no survivors. The air temperatures get to above the boiling point of water. So if you live in a city, that would be what you would be looking at. The scientific studies predict that 150 to 180 million tons of smoke and soot would rise into the stratosphere. And in a matter of 10 days to 2 weeks, the high winds in the stratosphere would spread it around the world. It would cause a global stratospheric smoke layer to form. And this smoke would block about 70% of the sunlight in the northern hemisphere and 35% in the southern. It would also destroy the protective ozone layer. That wouldn't be noticed immediately, but it would after the smoke begins to dissipate. That would be actually about 10 years before it really would go away. So 70% of the sunlight means that it's going to be at noon on a day in June, say in the northern hemisphere, it would be like having a full moon out at midnight. That's how much sunlight you would get. Southern hemisphere would be a little bit less than that, but it would still cause temperatures to be too cold for many years to grow crops. And, the cold weather would cause the death of most humans and land animals. Initially, the daily temperatures would fall below freezing every day for up to 3 years in central North America and central Eurasia. So that's what we're looking at with a nuclear war. Kennedy warned us about this, and this is a little, we're still at a point where we can stop this.
Never have the nations of the world had so much to lose or so much to gain. Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames. Save it we can, and save it we must. And then shall we earn the eternal thanks of mankind, and as peacemakers, the eternal blessing of God.
Well, Trump may be no Kennedy, but I agree with Scott Ritter that he needs to act, contact the Russians, do everything he can to stop this. I
want to applaud him for laying out this case succinctly, accurately, dispassionately, almost too dispassionately. It's not a criticism; it's a reflection of his professionalism. Except that people should be changing their underwear in fear after listening to what he said, and yet I think his soothing voice has calmed us into believing that maybe this was just another, academic presentation. It wasn't. He was laying out the imminent demise of mankind. And I want to reinforce that point. The Russian weapon that was used, I'm getting ready to publish a paper on this today, if we make it, that breaks down what I think it is. There's not much literature out there, but if you know the history of Russian ballistic missile design and such, this was a weapon that it's related to a weapon that the Russians were developing, the Soviets were developing back in the early 1980s called the Skorost. And the Skorost missile, 15Ja-66, was quickly developed by then Minister of Defense Ustinov to respond to the planned deployment of Pershing II missiles by the United States into Germany. The Russians were very afraid of the Pershing II, because once you launched the Pershing II, 7 minutes later, it hit Moscow. And the Russians were not happy about that. So they built this missile, the Skorost, which was, in the moment the Pershing II went to the field in a in a manner that looks, suspicious, they would take it out preemptively. That was what the Skorost was all about, to preemptively take out emerging threats. The system was nearing production when the INF, fact is, it was ready to go into production in March of 1987. But in December, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, so the Skorost went the way of history. People need to understand, again, I keep telling people, there was a time when we talked to the Soviets. There's a time when we talked to the Russians. I spent a lot of time at the Russian embassy in the last 2 years attending functions and talking to Anatoly Antonov, the ambassador, and talking to Major General Bobkin, the defense attaché, and talking to his officers and having very detailed conversations. I just, remind, Bobkin was a former, when we started talking, he's a strategic rocket forces guy who was in an SS-25 unit in Novosibirsk when I inspected it in 1990. What a small world we live in. And he was sent to the United States to help facilitate arms control talks, how to prevent the very crisis that we're in. Anatoly Antonov is an expert on the United States. He speaks English fluently. And he was, of course, the man who negotiated the New START treaty with Rose Gutmuller. He was ready to engage again on extending the New START to prevent exactly what's happening. Anatoly Antonov was here for 7 years, and the U.S. didn't talk to him. Babkin arrived, and the first thing that happened is that the Ukrainians got him blackballed in the defense attaché circuit, so nobody talked to him. Had they talked to him, as I did, they would have gotten an insight into how the strategic rocket forces felt about the INF Treaty, about the START Treaty, about disarmament, about what Gorbachev did to them, and how they feel that impacted their national security. And you would understand that they were very bitter about this entire experience. They felt that they had been weakened by it and that they were ready to regain the former glory of the Soviet strategic rocket forces. If you know anything, again, if you've studied Russian military history, Soviet military history, you understand that the present day is very much influenced by the past. So when the United States withdraws from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019, Putin said, we view this treaty as being very important to prevent war. And so we will not develop new intermediate range systems, and we'll act as if the treaty is in force so long as you don't deploy intermediate systems into Europe. Of course, earlier this year in a NATO exercise in Denmark, we deployed intermediate nuclear forces, intermediate range missiles, nuclear capable, to Denmark. And Putin said, okay, we're moving forward. And the byproduct of this is the missile that was tested the other day. But people don't understand what this missile is. This missile is the modern day version of the Skorost. You see, the Russians are building a missile that can be pushed forward and be ready to preempt Dark Eagle, our intermediate missile. The Russians just put the Mark 41 Aegis Ashore on notice in Poland. That is a target. The target that will destroy it is this. It doesn't use traditional MIRVs. I keep hearing people say multiple, independently targeted warheads. That's not what this was. Not at all. This is the new system. The new system is, instead of a bus, a plate, so to speak, where the warheads are attached, that separates from the missile and then comes in and releases the warheads to their target on a trajectory, though, because it's still moving as this happens. What we have now is independent mini missiles that are there, and they fire themselves. So the first stage takes it up, second stage puts it in, and then you fire these independent missiles. And these missiles, each one of them had 6 large submunitions on them. This is where the name hazelnut comes from. Because if you look at a hazelnut tree, you look at the pod of nuts, it's exactly what you see with these submunitions coming down. This missile was developed specifically to take out Dark Eagle missile arrays. If you take a look at the layout, the footprint of the Dark Eagle, where the radar is, where the command and communications are, where this missile is designed to annihilate that. People kept saying, where's the explosion? It's not meant to be high explosive. It's meant to be a kinetic kill. And these submunitions come down and they will kinetically kill everything on the ground. These submunitions come down at such velocity that if they hit the Aegis Ashore, it will be a smoking hole in the ground. This is what this missile is designed. Putin just put us on notice that he has a conventional missile system that is designed to preempt anything and everything NATO plans on doing to Russia, and there is no NATO response. There's nothing they can do about it. This is literally the equivalent of the most alpha wolf in the world coming in and pissing all over your home. That's what Putin just did. And it didn't have to be this way. Putin said right there, your withdrawal from the INF Treaty was the greatest mistake you have ever made, because now you have compelled us to do this. And here we are. We didn't want to be here, but because of all the provocations you've done, we have checkmated you. And that's the case. I don't think the West has woken up to what has just happened. It is over. over for the West. The only thing we can do is nuclear war. And sadly, we have somebody who believes that we can have a nuclear exchange. I just, again, want to have people reflect on what that means. It means the Biden administration is ready to sacrifice 100 million Americans for Ukraine. The Biden administration is ready to sacrifice 100 million Americans for Ukraine. And is that what we want? But guys, this is as real as it gets. This isn't theoretical. The reason why I went through all this, the stuff about this missile is to point out that sometimes when people talk about weapon systems and all that, people feel a little remote from it. They don't identify with it because it's something they don't understand. So I wanted to bring it in a way that hopefully everybody understood what's going on, what this represents, how real this missile is, and what the consequences of our actions are in compelling Russia to develop this missile, and now the impossible situation it's put us in. Because understand, it has put us in an impossible situation, a very dangerous situation. By revealing this missile and showing his willingness to use this, Putin has literally given the West two options: capitulate or nuclear war. We have to find a way to find a third option.
Tonight's guest is university professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he directed the Earth Institute from 2002 until 2016. He has been special advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries General and currently serves as a Sustainable Development Goals advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He has received 42 honorary doctorates, and his recent awards include the 2022 Tang Prize in Sustainable Development and the Order of the Cross from the President of Estonia. He will be beginning with a short speech on whether there can ever truly be a liberal international order. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
You talked about how there isn't this kind of struggle with China and how the United States, the US empire, doesn't need to position itself as kind of a leader. But there is kind of a struggle between, if not between US and China, between democracy and dictatorship in sort of various countries, various economies, various circles. And the United States is at the forefront of that, at least in economic terms. And of course, with dictatorships now becoming a lot more sustainable, they're not kind of obsessed with this self-subsistence. They're all trading with each other. Is there any way in which there is still a fight on our hands when it comes to politics?
Well, I'd love for the United States to be a functioning democracy and to be a good example for other countries. I don't believe the U.S. has any right or any ability to put in place a democracy in any other country, nor do I believe, by the way, that American democracy functions as a real democracy anymore on the life and death issues. Nobody has asked the American people anything about all these wars for decades. And by the way, I can tell you, and I'm telling you authoritatively and truly, they lie about every goddamn thing about these wars. And so that's not democracy either. Everything is phony. Everything is narrative. And so on the war and peace issues, the public has no say at all. If you were to ask the American people now, and in fact, Gallup does, do you support Biden's foreign policy? I think the support is, you can look it up, 25 to 35% perhaps. I don't even think it reaches 35%. Where's the democracy in this? It's a game. This is the deep state, and they have their wars, and every war has been phony. Some wars the American people are basically never told about. For example, the war in Syria. And you may actually hear from grown-up reporters who are lying through their teeth or ignorant beyond imagining that, oh, the war in Syria, yes, Russia intervened in Syria. Well, do you know that that Obama tasked the CIA to overthrow the Syrian government? starting 4 years before Russia intervened. What kind of nonsense is that? And how many times did the New York Times report on Operation Timber Sycamore, which was the presidential order to the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad? 3 times in 10 years. This is not democracy. This is a game. And it's a game of narrative. Why did the U.S. invade Iraq in 2003? Well, first of all, it was completely phony pretenses. It wasn't, oh, we were so wrong, they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. They actually did focus groups in the fall of 2002 to find out what would sell that war to the American people. Abe Schultzke, if you want to know the name of the PR genius. They did focus groups on the war. They wanted the war all the time. They had to figure out how to sell the war to the American people, how to scare the shit out of the American people. It was a phony war. Where did that war come from? You know what? It's quite surprising. That war came from Netanyahu, actually. You know that? It's weird. And the way it is that Netanyahu had from 1995 onward the theory that the only way we're going to get rid of Hamas and Hezbollah is by toppling the governments that support them. That's Iraq, Syria, and Iran. And the guy's nothing if not obsessive. And he's still trying to get us to fight Iran this day, this week. He's a deep, dark son of a bitch, sorry to tell you, because he's gotten us into endless wars, and because of the power of all of this in the U.S. politics, he's gotten his way. But that war was totally phony. So what is this democracy versus dictatorship? Come on. These are not even sensible terms. And even if they were sensible terms, under the UN Charter, we can have our democracy. You do what you want. It happens to be the case that China has had a centralized administrative state for 2,245 years, ever since Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi unified the Qin dynasty. This has been actually exceptional statecraft until Britain had the genius idea of fighting a war to sell opium in China in 1839, one of the most noble efforts imaginable. And that started the modern era of China. So I don't buy it at all. But even if it were true, it's illegal under international law, unwise, and, look at the great accomplishment of pouring in, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars into Afghanistan for 20 years to get from the Taliban regime to the Taliban regime. This is American genius at democracy promotion. They don't care at all about democracy, by the way, at all. They topple governments they don't like that won't do their bidding. They topple democracies if they don't like them. They'll topple anybody that they don't like. That's how it's worked all along. They never said, oh, we can't topple Mossadegh in 1953. He's a democratic government. No, they toppled a democratic government in Iran and put in a police state, which led to wonderful long-term relations with Iran because they really love the American people for that. So this is not about democracy. This is a game, and it's a terrible game, and it's a secret game, and it's played by the CIA, which is the most important agency in the United States, because they have complete secrecy, complete unaccountability. There was one review of the CIA 49 years ago, the Church Committee, and nothing since then. And as one of our CIA directors, Pompeo, said, as he was proudly explaining the role of the CIA to some Texas students a few years ago, and you can find it online, he said, what do we teach at the CIA? To lie, cheat, and steal. And that's a pretty good encapsulation of the methodology. And that is a very dangerous world being created that way. So China's not going to turn the U.S. into a dictatorship. Maybe the U.S. will turn into a dictatorship. Maybe it will just turn into a plain old plutocracy. Maybe it will turn into a military-industrial state as the complete dominance. I don't know. But it's not going to come from China. It's going to come from inside. That's where our risk is.
Thank you. I have a very simple question. What is your view on the upcoming US election, and who do you think will further, let's say, will make the situation better for all of us? Thank you.
Somebody else. I'm a firm non-voter in November. Sorry to say that's not the high-principled view. Everyone's supposed to vote and cherish their vote, but I will not vote for a candidate that doesn't meet the minimum threshold for being president of the United States. And we have two candidates, lead candidates, that don't. And so I decided I'm not voting, period. Because I want a candidate that actually has some possibility of doing something. Now, maybe they will, but not based on what they say. Every day is a profession of love for Israel's murderous reign in the Middle East. Okay, by itself, I wouldn't support that. That's enough for me, because Israel's committing a genocide in Gaza, and it's sickening, and it's obvious, and we see it every day. And if a candidate can't figure out to say something about that, I can't support them, period. About U.S. politics, it's been 5 miserable presidents, as far as I'm concerned, from Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. Awful. All of them. They brought us to the brink of nuclear war. Can't forgive them for that kind of recklessness. But when it comes to Ukraine, Harris says, we stand with Ukraine. Just everybody understand, what does it mean to stand with Ukraine like Boris Johnson stands with Ukraine? It means 2,000 Ukrainians killed or wounded severely every single day. That's not standing with Ukraine. That is standing with the destruction of Ukraine. It's exactly the opposite. And so that's a purely Orwellian idea that we're standing with Ukraine by continuing this war.
By your logic of nuclear war having an expected value of negative infinity, it seems that the US should never interfere when a nuclear power is doing something bad. Extending this logic, one could argue that if Nazi Germany had nuclear weapons, we should have just let them walk all over Europe and Russia. Is there a case in which the US should militarily intervene, even if there is some chance of nuclear war?
The US should intervene if we are attacked. That's different. We should not intervene to provoke. And that's the big difference. So let me just explain in 2 minutes the Ukraine war. This is not an attack by Putin on Ukraine in the way that we are told every day. This started in 1990, February 9th, 1990. James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said to Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward if you agree to German unification, basically ending World War II. And Gorbachev said, that's very important. Yes, NATO doesn't move, and we agree to German unification. The U.S. then cheated on this, already starting in 1994, when Clinton signed off on basically a plan to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine. This is when the so-called neocons took power, and Clinton was the first agent of this. And the expansion of NATO started in 1999 with Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. At that point, Russia didn't much care. There was no border other than with the Königsberg, but other than that, there was no direct threat. Then the U.S. led the bombing of Serbia in 1999. That was bad, by the way, because that was a use of NATO to bomb a European capital, Belgrade, 78 straight days to break the country apart. The Russians didn't like that very much. But Putin became president, they swallowed it, they complained, but even Putin started out pro-European, pro-American, actually asked maybe we should join NATO when there was still the idea of some kind of mutually respectful relationship. Then 9/11 came, then came Afghanistan, and the Russians said, yeah, we'll support you, we understand, to root out terror. But then came two other decisive actions. In 2002, the United States unilaterally walked out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This was probably the most decisive event, never discussed in this context. But what it did was trigger the U.S. putting in missile systems in Eastern Europe that Russia views as a dire, direct threat to national security by making possible a decapitation strike of missiles that are a few minutes away from Moscow. And we put in 2 Aegis missile systems. We say it's defense. Russia says, how do we know it's not Tomahawk nuclear-tipped missiles in your silos? You've told us we have nothing to do with this. And so we walked out of the ABM treaty unilaterally in 2002. And then in 2003, we invaded Iraq on completely phony pretenses, as I've explained. In 2004-5, we engaged in a soft regime change operation in Ukraine, the so-called First Color Revolution. It put in office somebody that I knew and I was friends with, and am kind of distantly friends with President Yushchenko, because I was an advisor to the Ukrainian government in 1993, 94, 95. And then the U.S. had its dirty hands in this. It should not meddle in other countries' elections. But in 2009, Yanukovych won the election and he became president, and in 2010 on the basis of neutrality for Ukraine. That calmed things down because the U.S. was pushing NATO, but the people of Ukraine on the opinion polls didn't even want to be in NATO. They knew that the country is divided between ethnic Ukrainian, ethnic Russian. What do we want with this? We want to stay away from your problems. So in February 22nd, 2014, the United States participated actively in the overthrow of Yanukovych. A typical U.S. regime change operation, have no doubt about it. And the Russians did us a favor. They intercepted a really ugly call between Victoria Nuland, my colleague at Columbia University now. And if you know her name and what she's done, have sympathy for me. Really. Between her and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, who's a senior State Department official till today. And they talked about regime change. They said, who's going to be the next government? Why don't we pick this one? No, Klitschko shouldn't go in. It should be Yatsenuk. Yes, it was Yatsenuk. And we'll get the big guy, Biden, to come in and do an attaboy, they say, pat him on the back. It's great. So they made the new government. And I happened to be invited to go there soon after that, not knowing any of the background. And then some of it was in a very ugly way explained to me after I arrived, how the U.S. had participated in this. All of this is to say, the U.S. then said, okay, now NATO's really going to enlarge. And Putin kept saying, stop, you promised no NATO enlargement. It's been, by the way, I forgot to mention, in 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, 7 more countries in the not 1 inch eastward. And then, okay, it's a long story, but the U.S. kept rejecting the basic idea, don't expand NATO to Russia's border in a context where we're putting in goddamn missile systems after breaking a treaty. 2019, we walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. In 2017, we walked out of the JCPOA, the treaty with Iran. This is the partner. This is the trust building. In other words, it's completely reckless U.S. foreign policy. On December 15th, 2021, Putin put on the table a draft Russia-U.S. security agreement. You can find it online. The basis of it is no NATO enlargement. I called the White House that next week after that, begging them, take the negotiations. Putin's offered something, avoid this war. Oh, Jeff, there's not going to be a war. Announce that NATO's not going to enlarge. Oh, don't worry, NATO's not going to enlarge. I said, oh, you're going to have a war over something that's not going to happen? Why don't you announce them? And he said, no, our policy is an open door. This is Jake Sullivan. Our policy is an open door policy. Open door for NATO enlargement. That is under the category of bullshit, by the way. You don't have your right to put your military bases anywhere you want and expect peace in this world. You have to have some prudence. There's no such thing as an open door that we're going to be there and we're going to put our missile systems there and that's our right. There's no right to that. We declared in 1823, Europeans don't come to the Western Hemisphere. That's the Monroe Doctrine. The whole Western Hemisphere, after all. Okay, anyway, they turned down the negotiations. Then the special military operation started. And 5 days later, Zelensky says, okay, neutrality. And then the Turks said, we'll mediate this. And I flew to Ankara to discuss it with the Turkish negotiators because I wanted to hear exactly what was going on. So what was going on was they reached an agreement with a few odds and ends. And then the United States and Britain said, no way. You guys fight on. We got your back. We don't have your front. You're all going to die. But we got your back as we kept pushing them into the front lines. That's 600,000 deaths now of Ukrainians since Boris Johnson flew to Kyiv to tell them to be brave. Absolutely ghastly. So when you think about your question, we have to understand we're not dealing with, as we're told every day, with this madman like Hitler coming at us and violating this and violating that, and he's going to take over Europe. This is complete bogus, fake history that is a purely PR narrative of the U.S. government. And it doesn't stand up at all to anyone that knows anything. And if you try to say a word of this, I got completely cut out of the New York Times back in 2022 after writing my whole life columns for them. Oh, I send this. Okay. And by the way, online, it's not even space. You know, there's no limit. They could publish 700 words. They would not publish, since then, 700 words for me about what I saw with my own eyes about what this war is about. They won't do it. We're playing games here. So, God forbid a nuclear power comes at us. I don't know what's going to happen. But we came at them. And to the CIA director, I say, don't tell me whether Putin's bluffing or not. I read your memo of 2008 about how much Russia is concerned about NATO enlargement to Ukraine. It was leaked by Julian Assange, by the way. The same guy who's our CIA director was U.S. ambassador to Russia then in 2008. He wrote a memo called Niet means Niet, which explained how it's not just Putin, it's the whole Russian political class against having NATO in Ukraine. And then he tells us now, don't worry about it. Because they're playing games with you and me. And I really resent it. So if we someday face this catastrophe that you're presenting, there won't be a good answer, by the way. President Kennedy, incidentally, in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, made a side remark. He said, "I'd rather have my daughter be red than dead," when the bumper sticker slogan was "better dead than red." And he said it the opposite. You know, he's a human being. He's a wonderful human being. And so I don't know what the answer to the question is, but that's the right answer, is we have to get out of this, what President Kennedy called the sword of Damocles, the nuclear sword of Damocles hanging over our heads, which is really the greatest risk that we face of all.
This was a statement made by President Putin on September 12th when Keir Starmer came to the White House when they were set to initiate this attack, but was delayed until, well, after Trump was elected.
Если это решение будет принято, это будет означать не что иное, как прямое участие стран НАТО, Соединенных Штатов, европейских стран в войне на Украине. Это их прямое участие. И это уже, конечно, существенным образом меняет саму суть, саму природу конфликта. Это будет означать, что страны НАТО, США, европейские страны воюют с Россией.
Biden has shifted every single position that he said was a red line. So I don't see why he's not going to violate this one as well. So yeah, I think they're going, they can't afford a defeat, a Ukrainian defeat before the election. That's what they're worried about. And so they're trying to prevent that. And so they've convinced themselves that if they just give in and provide these long-distance missiles that will strike farther inside of Russia, that it will help Ukraine, help put the Russians on their heels. I mean, it's incredibly dangerous and foolish. And, you know, it's up to Russia to figure out how long it's going to continue to put up with this. You know, I guess I understand. I appreciate President Putin's desire to show restraint and keep this as a special military operation, but the West is at war with Russia, and I don't think people aren't getting their brains around that. We keep dancing around the edges, pretending that this is not going to happen. It's going to happen, and it's not going to change the military situation as far as what Ukraine is facing. Ukraine is facing defeat. They will be defeated. But it gets more to the point that the West, instead of seeking a peaceful way out and talking to Russia, is preferring confrontation.
So this is really an unnecessary escalation, if it's true. The attackums require U.S. assistance and NATO assistance because of the information flow that is necessary to provide to the flight of the missile. So that necessarily brings in NATO participation in that regard to assist the Ukrainians. I expected something like this only because you have the French and the British also wanting to escalate in order to drag the United States in and lock in the United States to continue to have to provide assistance.
Attacks against the Bryansk region where these missiles were used, it's a signal saying that they want an escalation. How our position change if these long-range missiles, 300-kilometer range missiles, will be authorized to use against our country. They now say that we are going to strike you as far as 300 kilometers deep. And everyone is saying that the authorization is there. Even Borrell said that it's official, and Europeans, they had this discussion, and then they decided that each of them will make their own decision in this regards, whether they authorize to use their long-range weapons for Ukrainians. I'm not going to speculate on this topic. We have our nuclear doctrine that was officially published, and it says now officially, now it's a law, that all the things that President spoke about a month or slightly more. And I hope that they are going to read this doctrine, not how they read the UN Charter, saying only things that they need, but they will read the entire doctrine in all its interconnectedness.
In terms of, Putin's comments on our force posture or our defense systems, I'm just not going to get into that. But what I can tell you is that, again, we're going to continue to support Ukraine with what it needs to be successful on the battlefield. And I think you asked about the pre-notification. We were pre-notified briefly before the launch, but I'm just not going to get into more specifics than that.
Professor Dugin, Russian-Ukraine conflict will enter its third year in February 2025. Earlier this week, we saw reports that Biden has authorized Ukraine to attack Russia with American long-range missiles. How do you expect the conflict to unfold in the coming months? Will we see escalation or a push for peace talks?
So Biden has done that in order to get rid of Trump, because now he wants to provoke nuclear war, full-scale nuclear war, in order to not let Trump to become president, because if there is nuclear war, he could blame Trump not to be patriotic enough, and that will be the end. Or to put Trump at least in the awkward situation when he will come to the presidency, to the office inside of full-scale war with Russia. And he will be obliged to follow the same agenda as globalists started. So I think that was inner political decision more than international decision. It could provoke nuclear war and destruction of humanity because our country will be obliged to respond. So maybe we are very close to the end of Kali Yuga, and the evil path has succeeded in provoking destruction of humanity. No one could be sure that such thing will not happen. So if we have nuclear weapon, sometime there will be a moment when it will be used as a strategical weapon, and that is logical, because if you gather more and more and more toxic elements, so you will be you will pay for that. So if you prefer materialism and technologies then rather than spiritual matter, so you will pay for that by extinction of your mechanical civilization. So nobody could say, now the history is open, so peace could arrive only after our victory in Ukraine. After full liberation of all territory of Ukraine, that will be the condition for us to peace talk. Before that, nothing. So, but Trump could not understand that. Maybe he will not, he will have the wrong understanding of our motivations, interests in Ukraine, and our understanding of ontology of this conflict. But I think that we have the chance with Trump, and if we will be alive when Trump comes finally to White House, that will be great, that will be a miracle, because I think Biden he is the one of the finger of the same Asuric entity as Soros. So they are the same entity, the same infernal power that tries to destroy humanity. It is Kali Yuga, and Ukraine is for us Kurukshetra, where we fight against our global enemies. And Putin is hesitating Arjuna, who cannot decide or fight or not, because he he sees there the people, friends, and parents, Ukrainians are the same, our brethren. So he's very hesitating, Arjuna, but we know what is the end of Bhagavad Gita. That was fight, finally. And Krishna has said to Arjuna, Arjuna, don't hesitate, fight. It is your karma. And we appreciate your intentions and not results. The results belong to me. I am God and I will decide. And you should follow your path. So I think the same for Ukraine. It is our Kurukshetra and Putin is Arjuna. He is heroic actor in our history and maybe in the world's history. But he will fight until the end.
In the end time, that when Russia is baited into this war, which is coming, which is around the corner, while so many of the scholars of Islam are either asleep or drinking Tetari, I don't know why, they will not comment on contemporary affairs using the Quran and the Sunnah, I don't know why. And we are standing at the doorstep now of that great war, which is going to lead to many other wars.
PIG, pig-headed obsession to rule the world. It doesn't matter to them what is the price, that doesn't matter. So if the price is world war with Russia, so be it. If the price is that most of mankind must perish, so be it. It doesn't matter to them. The Zionists, they don't have mind of their own to think. Their minds are controlled by Dajjal. So the stage is now set for Armageddon, or what the Prophet ﷺ called the Malhama. So yes, I'm saying that it is now inevitable that nuclear war is coming. We cannot avoid it. Not because Russia wants nuclear war, not because NATO wants nuclear war, none of them want nuclear war, but because somebody else wants nuclear war. Who is the somebody else? Somebody else is someone who wants to succeed the United States as the next ruling state in the world. The Judeo-Christian Zionist Alliance knows it. They want Israel to replace the United States as the next ruling state in the world. In the same way that Pax Americana replaced Pax Britannica, so too Pax Judaica will replace Pax Americana. The US dollar is now in irreversible decline. The United States as a world power is now in irreversible decline, and Putin knows that. And Israel is preparing to replace the United States. But Israel is small, and the world is big. How can Israel rule the world? Yes, we can understand the United States. But how can Israel rule the world? Answer, either Israel has to become much bigger, or the world has to become much smaller. Which will it be? That's why they want nuclear war. That's why they want nuclear war. So that the world will become much smaller. My opinion, I can be wrong, my opinion is that you can't live in North America after nuclear war. It won't be habitable. Or Europe, no. Those will be wasteland. My opinion is that what is left of the world after the nuclear war would be a world that is small enough for Israel to manage. And therefore, we see a passage now from Russia to NATO, to Syria, to the Malhama, to Akhir al-Zaman. And you know what happens after Israel takes over from the United States? The Dajjal's day like a week will begin. And when the week is ended, then the Dajjal will appear in human form. These Christians, when Muslims conquered Constantinople, then the Patriarch, who is like the Pope of this part of the Christian world, he announced that the headquarters are now transferred to Russia. So this part of the Christian world, which is described in the Quran as Rome, has its headquarters in Russia. So when the Prophet said that you'll make an alliance with Rome, of course this is Akhiru Zaman, that you're going to make an alliance with Rome in Akhiru Zaman. Akhiru Zaman doesn't come to the world until you see the tall buildings, huh? And so we are now seeing the fulfillment of that prophecy. So let's go to Surah Al-Ma'idah. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا اليهود والنصارى أولياء. I hope the Darul Uloom is listening, because they're closing the doors to me all over Britain. They're closing the doors to me. And the funny thing is, the more they close the doors of the Darul Uloom and the Masjid to me, the more knowledge Allah gives to me. So keep on closing the doors. Keep on closing the doors. O you who have faith, do not take the Jews and do not take the Christians as your friends and allies. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا اليهود والنصارى أولياء. The schoolboy takes this part of the ayah by itself in isolation. And the schoolboy concludes that Allah is referring to all Jews and all Christians when He said, don't take them as your friends and allies. But that's wrong. Because the Quran is non-contradictory. Allah says so in the Quran. لو كان من عند غير الله, had this Quran come from any source other than from Allah, لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا, they would have found in this Quran endless inconsistencies and discrepancies. But this Quran is free from inconsistencies and contradictions. But if you say, Allah is saying, don't take all Jews and don't take all Christians as your friends and allies, then there will be contradiction in the Quran. Why? Because Allah says that in the end times, there will be a Christian people who will be closest in love and affection for you. This is Surah Al-Ma'idah. So you have to say to the people who are closest in love and affection for you, we can't be friends with you. That's contradictory. So there cannot therefore be an understanding of this ayah. Don't take all Jews and don't take all Christians as your friends and allies. Well then what is the Quran saying? Is the Darul Uloom listening to me? Allah is speaking of not all Christians, but some Christians. And He's not speaking of all Jews, He's speaking of some Jews. He says, do not take such Jews and do not take such Christians as your friends and allies. Who? Who? Here's the answer in the words which follow. But the Darul Uloom would not listen to me. بَعْدُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ بَعْدُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ. Do not take such Jews and do not take such Christians as your friends and allies, who themselves are friends and allies of each other. The closest in love and affection for you. Which Christian people is Allah talking about? So you have to look for a Christian people who are still holding on to the monastic way of life. Where are they? Who are the Christians who to this day are holding on to monasticism? Even if you perceive them to be hostile to you now because of past grievances, the Quran cannot be false. You can change their hearts and tomorrow they'll be the closest in love and affection to you. Yes. I hope Egypt is listening. So you'll identify them, you recognize them because of the institution of monasticism. And then Allah says a fourth thing about them. But one more thing by which you can recognize this Christian with whom you will make an alliance. وَأَنَّهُمْ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ وَأَنَّهُمْ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ. They're not an arrogant people. They don't want to rule the world. It's because they do not have arrogance stamped on their forehead. These are not Christians who want to get the whole world to become carbon copies of themselves. Huh? They are not an arrogant people who believe that they have a birthright of superiority and that the rest of the world are like cockroaches. They're only natives and we have the burden to civilize the rest of the world. You can't study international relations and study the history of international politics without coming face to face with this arrogance. The colonization of the rest of the world so that they can civilize the rest of the world. This is not Orthodox Christianity, not at all.